For this part of our notes, we're going to take a look at the flower. So what is actually the flower? The flower is the actual reproductive structure of angiosperms. So if you remember our monocot and dicot discussions, monocot and dicots are angiosperms. And that's what the flower is going to end up being. Now there's different parts to the flower. And we group them up into three different categories. We have our sterile parts, we have male parts, and we have female parts. The first thing that we have is what's called a sepal. Now these plants that I'm going to be using to show you are not real plants, but they still have their parts to them, or stuff that represents the real parts. The sepal is going to be the green stuff that's located right underneath the flower petals here. It would be these things right here that I'm holding, and also this hard plastic thing to it. But it's going to be hard on an actual flower too, because the sepal are going to be leaf-like structures, so they kind of look like leaves here. And they're going to be around the flower. And they're important to the flower because they're used for protection. Because what's going to happen, insects are going to crawl up the stem, crawl, 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 crawl. And they're going to want to get to the center part of the flower. What the sepal does is that it kind of makes it a little bit more difficult for the insects to get there, the ones that are crawling. Now obviously the ones that are flying by like bees or butterflies aren't affected by it, but the crawly ones like ants are sometimes deterred or pushed back because it takes too much effort to get around the sepal. Now the second thing that is considered a sterile part are the petals themselves, the parts that look pretty on the flower. They come in different varieties of colors, and they're also leaf-like. They look like leaves, but they're part of the flower. The reason for the colors is that, and why the petals are important, is that they attract pollinators, and different pollinators respond to different colors. Now, what we're going to get into next are the different parts broken down into male and female. The first thing we're going to look at are the male parts, which the general male parts of the flower is what's going to be called the stamen. S-T-A-M-E-N. So it's got men right in it. So that's how you can know that they're associated with the male part there. It has the word men in the actual word. And what the stamen is, it's a combination of two different parts. And I got another flower that shows this. I'll try to get it as close as possible. You may not be able to see it too well there because it doesn't focus a lot on it. There we go. So those little white things in the middle there that are kind of blurry, I'll kind of point them out here. Oh, there we go. This part right here that my finger is behind. That part right there, that is the stamen. Now it's going to be composed of two different parts. One part is what's called the filament. That's going to be the long, stem-like or stalk-like, whatever word you want to use for it. It's going to be the thin part of the stamen. On the top of it is this little bulb, this little kind of rounded edge part there. And that little rounded part at the edge there, the little bulb at the end, that is what's called the anther. Now the anther, that's going to be the thing that produces the pollen, which is going to be needed for the flower in order to do the reproductive process. So in general, the male part is responsible for producing the pollen, which is required for the fertilization of the plants itself. Now what we also have is the female part, which the female reproductive part is known as the pistil. And usually there's, I forgot to say about the male parts, is that usually there's a lot of stamen to it. Typically there's going to be, the stamen are going to outnumber the number of pistils, which usually there's only one, maybe two pistils in a flower, whereas there could be anywhere from 8 to 10 stamen a part of it, because it needs to produce a lot of pollen in order to increase the chances of pollinating out there. So for the female parts, we have the pistil, which is going to be composed out of three parts itself: the stigma, the style, and the ovary. So what we have here, this one's a little bit bigger, so hopefully it comes across better. The bigger part's on the outside here. Let's see for the camera. Alright, so that part right here that I'm touching, this is going to be the pistil. Now the part at the top here, it's going to be, now obviously these are fake, so they're not going to actually have this to them, but the very top of this is what's called the stigma. And this is going to be a very sticky, it's got a sticky fluid on it. And what it actually does is that it traps the pollen in the stickiness. The rest of the part that's sticking out here is what's known as the style. And basically what it's going to end up doing is that it's a slender tube that connects the stigma down to the ovary. So it's what's the pollen is going to travel down the style in order to get to the ovary. Now the ovary, they're not going to show these on these types of flowers because they're fake, and why would they on the fake flower? But we'll look at them next week when we do our flower dissection. What's going to actually happen with the ovary is that the ovary is going to have inside of it the egg, or the egg cells. Just like we have sperm and egg cells, the same thing happens with plants. The sperm cells are in the pollen. The ovary has inside of it the egg cells, which are typically known as ovules. And inside of there, it's going to grow the seed. And the ovary is going to protect the seed as they develop, so they're in the inside there. And we'll look at it from their flower dissection more closely of what the ovary actually is going to contain. Now on the back you'll have a diagram. I'm going to try to show this as easy as possible. So here's going to be the different parts of the flower. You got your petals that are surrounding it. You got your anther and filament, which together make up the stamen itself. Those are all on the left side there. And then you got your sepal down below. If you want to label the anther and filament as the stamen, go ahead and do so. You'll notice I put all the male parts on one side and all the female parts on the other to help separate them. You can see that there's more than one stamen on this flower picture in the diagram, but there's only one pistil, and that's how most of our flowers are going to end up looking. And you can see the different parts of the female one over there. You got your stigma and your style and your ovary. In that order, stigma at the top, style's a little tube, and then the ovary is going down below there. So there is your different parts of your flower for your diagram. The last kind of thing that we're going to look at as far as flowers go is the step of pollination and fertilization. And in order to get any of this looked at, we're going to be talking about fruits. And what a fruit is going to be is that it is a ripened ovary that inside of it has a seed. So essentially anything that has seeds inside of it. Now the steps as far as pollination and fertilization go, and this is basically how plants are going to reproduce, is that the first thing is that the tree has to produce a flower. And we're dealing with angiosperms here because that's going to be the ones that are mainly going to do their pollination and fertilization. Your gymnosperms, which have cones, are going to have a little bit of a different process. We're going to focus more on the angiosperm way, the flowering method. Step 2 is actually done something kind of back-to-back. We have something that the male part does and the female part does. The males produce the pollen. Specifically, the anther produces the pollen. And then we have the eggs being produced in the ovary. Those kind of happen simultaneously during their mating season. The third step is that the pollen becomes airborne by some way, shape, or form, either by wind or by water or by an animal coming around and brushing by it, getting in fur or hairs or something. The pollen is going to get stuck on the stigma. Remember, the stigma is the sticky part of the female reproductive part of the plant, the pistil. So the pollen is going to stick to the stigma. What happens as part of the fourth step is that the pollen is what's going to produce a pollen tube that travels all the way to the ovary. So the pollen produces this little tube that goes through the style and goes all the way down to the ovary. That allows the sperm cells to travel down. Then what happens is that the sperm and egg cells mix and develop into a seed. So the two cells, just like how we create a zygote, it's creating a zygote basically too, but we call it a seed in this case. Then the ovary and the other structures start to grow and develop, and that's what's going to create our fruit. And then the fruit either falls off the tree, the fruit gets ate, the seeds are going to end up growing into a new plant, and that's the seventh and final step. So all that goes into what's going to be creating a flower and all the different parts and pieces of a flower itself. Like I mentioned before in this video, we're going to do a little flower dissection in the next coming days. So we're going to take a closer look at all these different parts of the plant that we've been looking at as far as the flowers go, in order to help better understand how this fertilization pollination could end up being.